Everyone, in this video, we're going to talk about sketching ideas and tools to use. When I think about sketching ideas for a typeface or really anything that I'm working on, I really think about 4 categories of tools, and we'll talk about those in this video. The first one is going to be handheld, the more traditional idea when we draw and work with type. The second will be an exaggerated form of those handheld tools. The third is going to be grids and modules, which we'll display here in a minute. And the fourth will be experimental, which is quite a bit more fun, but leads to unknown results. That's how we define experimental. First, we'll start with our handheld tools. Now, I have this lovely art supply of all the equipment that students leave after they graduate, so we'll get to this smorgasbord of drawing utensils. I'm going to start with a charcoal pencil just so that you can see it. It has a nice high contrast. And because we generally start with a pen or a pencil when we draw type. Now when we're drawing type with a handheld tool, my first tip is going to be use a bigger scale. Oftentimes when students start drawing type, they think of what they're used to writing at, right? And they'll draw something and they'll be like, oh, I'm going to draw my lowercase n, and it'll look something like that. And it's tiny, it's hard to manage, and it doesn't quite do it justice. We don't have a ton of control. Now, type did start as handwriting. All of the traditional typefaces that we use that are proliferated everywhere come from a form of handwriting. This way that I've drawn here is this outlined format of handwriting versus the actual form making. As if I was going to draw something more like this. This second one is more of a handwriting. And this is what we think about when we start to draw letter forms. If we're going to use a handheld tool, the scale that we're going to start with is something closer to that, and using the tool for what it's good for. This is a charcoal pencil, which I can sharpen, but it will dull really quickly. If I want to get into a script typeface or a serif typeface, I might use a fountain pen or something like a parallel pen. I've got a few parallel pens here. Hopefully they haven't dried up. But if I were going to draw a typeface, thinking about a serif, and I just want to start and iterate really quickly, I might use a parallel pen. You can see using this sort of broad square tipped helps me draw a more defined thicks and thins. It'll get into more contrast of that typeface. There are dozens and dozens of tools to use at the handheld scale. So when you're sketching with a handheld tool, remember to think about writing it at that small size. But for both our video purposes and teaching purposes, I tend to use an exaggerated format. So this is our second form. When we use an exaggerated format, it's easier to manipulate the details and the nuances of letter form. So again, I'm going to use this charcoal pencil so it has a higher contrast so you can see it. But we'll talk about this exaggerated scale. Instead of thinking about the letter form as if it were this small thing that I'm going to read in a book, I'm going to think about it as an object. Sometimes I like to use reams of paper. I'll go to Staples or Office Max or wherever you get a ream of paper from, and I will use 1 or 2 reams of paper to draw a typeface. And I like to use 1 sheet of paper per letter form. So if my sheet of paper is normally about 8.5 by 11, it looks something like this. I'll draw a line at the bottom and a line near the top. I'll give myself a width so it has some idea of how wide this character is going to be. And then I'll go in and draw letter forms sort of the way that we're used to drawing things, which is using these module shapes, right? So if I like that there, and I actually drew this quite a bit narrow, so we'll widen this out and say it's going to be something like that. Maybe in this, I'm starting with the lowercase n, which is the same letter forms we'll start with when we start to vectorize. But we'll draw something that'll have a curve like that, and a curve that does something in there. And you can see that there's quite a bit of difference in the way that I'm able to draw this letter form versus the way that I'm able to draw these letter forms. That scale is a really big difference maker, and This is why I tend to use the exaggerated format when I'm thinking about my letter forms. It lets me pay attention to some of these details. The other thing that an exaggerated form lets me do is be more mechanical with the anatomy of my body. Again, when I was drawing those little forms, I'm up here, and the tendency is to set my hand on the paper and then move my knuckles and joints. Now, they're not really meant for that sort of radial movement. Versus when I'm drawing at a larger scale, I'm going to use my whole shoulder, my elbow, all that sort of thing. And so when I draw my circles, I'm using a ball and socket joint, which is meant to draw circles. So you can do it quite a bit easier, and you can say, okay, this is my O. I'm working from a strange angle here, so you'll have to tell me if this looks all right. But it's something that I can draw from. It's a little bit easier to think about at this sort of a scale. It's also easy then to think about my details. So if I rough in some of these things, and I now know a little bit of type, or as you go through these lessons, you'll learn a bit more. You can play with these details and say, you know what, I don't like the way that this square joint meets that round joint. So instead, I'm going to work it through here and into that. In a large scale, exaggerated format, I have the space to do that. I hope you're enjoying the content in this video so far. Hopefully it's an easy letter, something that's not too crazy, and you're figuring out exactly how you want to design the letter form. If you haven't done so already, please like and subscribe to the channel. That helps me grow and produce these videos. If you've already subscribed to the channel, be sure to comment and share this video with somebody who you think might gain something from them. I'm going to show you one more exaggerated scale before we move on to grids and modules. One of my favorite tools to use is a square piece of graphite or Conti. They look something like this, though they come in sticks much larger, and you can break it down to be the sort of width that you like when you think about the strokes that you're making. If I have something like this is actually a piece of oil pastel or just pastel. I can manipulate this tool however I see fit. So this is basically a larger version of this parallel pen that we looked at when we're talking about our handheld tools. What it allows me to do is make marks that are quite decisive and quite in the way. Here I'm making a mark, and now I'm playing with the proportions of my typeface already. If I draw my N at this scale, you can see I have this sort of thin, condensed typeface. Versus if I draw my N at this scale, I have a much closer, a much narrower proportion to typeface. And just like that, I can draw two ideas out in less than 10 seconds. The piece of Conti or a larger scale like this also lets me do interesting things with the tool that I might not be able to do otherwise with a parallel pen, or that are just frankly easier to do with your whole arm or your whole body than it is with your hands on a piece of paper. For instance, I might think about drawing a black letter form. And I could say, if I'm going to draw a black letter N, I can do these types of things. And it's quite a bit easier for me to manipulate that and move that tool around. Similarly, it's also easier to turn the tool as we work. So if I'm thinking about designing a sans serif typeface, I can really easily draw something that's like this. And then I can use this tool and move it and twist it as it moves to help me get that sort of monoline look that I'm working for. As I'm drawing these, then you can go back in with that first tool that we used or another tool. You can mix and match to design things and say, you know what, actually I want this to come out a little bit further, or I want to push this a little bit further, those types of things. The last thing that an exaggerated tool helps you with is figuring out this axis. So in a later video, we'll learn about some of these terms, but we'll do some here because it's important to know. When I'm working with a tool like this piece of Conti here, if I hold it straight or parallel, so if I hold it at this sort of an angle, when I draw something like an O, you can see that the weight is very much on the sides, and the thin are on the top and the bottom. if I hold it at something like that sort of an angle, and I draw the same letter form, now the weights are sort of down here and up there, right? In perfect match with that angle. And the thins are here and here. In a later video, we'll learn that that's called contrast. I can show you that with this red crayon here. The perpendicular line to that angle of holding corresponds with the way that we use this letter form here. Similarly, when we look at this letter form and the second O, when we tilted it a few degrees, that gives this letter form its stress and its angle. Now this happens pretty naturally when we're writing and when we're drawing with a handheld tool. But when we use it at an exaggerated angle or an exaggerated tool, it's easier for us to manipulate that angle and be really precise. Third, we'll talk about grids and modules. Now, a lot of times when we talk about grids in type design, people are thinking about pixel fonts or something that's really primitive, and that's a fine place to start and think about it. If we were going to draw something like a 5x5 square, so let's say we have our square that's going to be something like this, we can then think about how every single letter form might fit into that square. If I was going to draw an N, for example, I might first fill in these shapes and then know, okay, I have to fill in this over here, and then I have to get into an arch. So we'll cut that out, and I can do a couple things. I could either join it here or I could join it over there. The benefit of a grid is that it's easy to iterate in that space really quickly. If I were drawing in a grid, I'd make both the letter form without this one filled and with that one filled, and I'd make it with this one filled and not that one filled. And I'd compare the two side by side to really quickly see which one's working better. The thing I think people underestimate about grids is how complex we can make them. Imagine if instead of a 5x5 grid like we have here, we had something much more complex. Bam! And like magic, I've gone ahead and drawn one for you. In this grid, you can see there's many, many more lines. I've drawn both vertical lines and horizontal lines, but I've also gone ahead and drawn some diagonal lines and even some lines of flare. So we have some that do this sort of a thing. When we're thinking about our grids, you can think about the characteristics you might want your typeface to have. I've seen some really beautiful typefaces that come out of grids that actually mix and match sort of grids and mix and match measurements, and that complexity gives you a lot more room to work within. Again, if we're thinking about drawing a lowercase n here, think about all the places that I could stop or start my strokes, all the places that I could use to draw my diagonals or my curves, or even all the things that I could do at the base of the foot of those ends. The more complex grids also work well when we get into more tricky characters. We also want to talk about modules. Now, they work the same way, they just are less like repeated grids or tightly duplicated things. You could think of a module as something like a circle that might fit, instead of being in this nice row, fits in this sort of honeycomb pattern, or something that we might move around the page. It's a repeated shape, but it's not in a repeated order. One of the benefits, I think, that comes from grids is that it really starts to build up our understanding of how repeated the characters are. So when we're designing a character, there are bits and pieces of each character that will repeat over and over and over. And when we first start drawing our letter forms, we'll talk about, and I'll show you this really amazing illustration about how many components there actually are to letter forms, because there's not all that many. When we use grids, it's easy to duplicate and repeat those. Lastly, we'll talk about experimental tools for drawing typefaces. Now, there's a fine line when teaching examples of experimental design and what you might receive or what you might go on and do. An experimental object or an experimental method for making really means that you don't know what the outcome is going to be. Now, if you don't know what the outcome is going to be, sometimes that can be anxiety-inducing or really terrifying. I think it's this really fun place that design and creativity exist within. So when we think about experimental design, we can think of a couple of these methods right here. Henri Matisse used to make his drawings using a 5 or 6 foot pole because he wanted to exaggerate the human form. So you could draw a typeface or a series of typefaces based off of different length sticks. You could double your efforts and see how good your left hand is compared to your right hand, or your right hand compared to your left hand, and draw one hand one way and one hand the other. You could use offcuts from old student work, throw them on the table, and see what sticks. On the table would be better. You could use tape to draw your strokes and use it as a mark-making tool. Here, it's already folding, something that I didn't expect, and it would make a really interesting form. See how this lowercase n goes. Yeah. Look at that. You could go down to your local turf distributor, see if they have samples of turf, and cut letter forms out of turf. You could even draw a really normal sans serif typeface, laser cut it into some acrylic, cast it in ice, and see what happens when it melts. All of these and an infinite number more are ways that we can use experimental tools or use something that may not be made to design type to design really interesting letter forms. So that's how I would pretty loosely categorize 4 areas of type design tools and what you might use as you think about sketching your typefaces. Those are handheld things, exaggerated forms, grids and modules, and of course experimental tools. My advice is that when you think about your typeface, or if you have this idea of what that end goal is going to be, the tool is going to help you build and emulate what it is you want to have finished. So if you think about your finished product, think about what tool is going to help you most to get there. When you're in the middle and you're lost or confused or you're having struggles, sometimes it's helpful to switch tools and use something else to help you solve a particular visual problem. All of this to say that type design should be fun, and at this point it should still be fun and experimental, and I encourage you to use the tools to your own advantage. Thanks again for liking the video. As always, please make sure you're subscribed and that you like the video so we can keep pushing these forward. If you've already done that, share them, comment on them, just spread the design love everywhere.